Welcome back to day 2 of excerpts from Guru Vachaka Kovai and my commentary on it. And I want to encourage everyone, as I'm commenting, if you have questions or comments, feel free to chime in anytime. So, because this is all just sort of a miscellaneous assortment of topics and things that I found, interesting and worth bringing up, because Guru Vachaka Kovai is so long. So, sort of things that struck me as I was reading it. So I'm going to start now with verse 283, and it reads, "Just as the sight of a lion appearing in its dream will awaken an elephant from sleep, so also the darshan of the Sadguru will awaken the disciple from the dream of this present waking state, which is merely an illusion, into the state of jnana." So I like this because it has a few different interesting components. One is the metaphor, obviously, of the lion and the elephant, and the idea of within the dream, which is this seeming life, there is a component of it which, though it is part of the dream, is nevertheless like the link to the non-dream. Though it's part of the dream, it has a function which gets you out of the dream. And that is effectively, that is what the techniques of surrender and self-inquiry, which Maharshi teaches, are about. They are about either through self-inquiry, pursuing the I, or through surrender, moving away from objects. In both cases, moving towards this sort of center point of the illusion, which is the ego. And the pointing towards the ego, is, you could say, it's in effect the ultimate, at every stage, I would say, grace is in effect. In order to be interested in the spiritual search at all, in order to hear about the techniques, in order to have the desired practice, and then once you practice, to be awakened, and finally, it's all grace. And where does that grace come from? It comes from the Sadguru. The Sadguru is not a physical person. Sadguru is another name for the self. Without the self blessing of God, or self, call it what you will, nothing can happen, spiritually speaking. So you should keep in mind that though Maharshi advocates intense sadhana, intense practice, nevertheless, one should keep in mind that it is ultimately grace that animates the entire search, start to bottom, top to finish, top to bottom. Stop. You can mix that up. Start to finish, top to bottom, beginning to end. But this notion of something which is on the border in a way between two states. This is important because this is what the nature of the ego is, actually. The I, which you're looking for in inquiry, I like to analogize it to something like, think of a painting, okay? And at the center of this painting, there appears to be, like any other part of the painting, what appears to be a small white dot, let's say. It looks like paint. It looks like just a piece of white paint, but it's actually not a piece of white paint. It's actually a small puncture in the canvas.
Embossing.
Sorry?
They got embossing technique.
Is that what it is? Okay, yeah, but it's actually a hole. It's actually a tiny hole through which light is streaming. That's the idea, right? But it looks like it's just part of the painting. But if you look very closely, it turns out to be a hole. This is something like what the nature of I is. So when you examine it, that is in effect that moment when you recognize, oh, it's not a piece of paint, it just looked like it. It's actually a hole through which you can look through it. That's like the lion waking you up, you might say. Okay.
That's like
the lion waking the elephant up. Yeah, exactly. Not really. It could be you too. Okay, so Next verse I'm going to comment on is verse 289. It says, destroy the stealthy ego, which is the thought, I am the body, either by inquiring, who am I, or by melting into nothing, by always thinking with love of God's feet. That which will then remain is the light of jnana, or knowledge. So again, the ego is stealthy. Why is the ego stealthy? Because the ego, the sense, that is to say, the sense of existing, right, with which we start self-inquiry, is it's like an illusion which is built from the structure of moving thought. You know, that's why it's stealthy, because when you look for it, it shifts. It seems to be here, and you look for it here, now it seems to be there. You look for it there, it seems to be someplace else. So it's moving. It's moving precisely because it is not what it seems to be. It is the nature of the ego precisely to be not what it seems to be, not what it seems to be, not what it seems to be. So you have to destroy this. It basically, you know, in this text he's saying, in this verse he's saying, it's a thought, I am the body. I'm the body stands in really for I'm the body, I'm the mind, I'm my memories, I'm my relationships, is all like the body collectively speaking. So, so that thought has to be destroyed either by, you know, these are the two paths that I talked about, right? Either by inquiring, who am I? And he says, you know, he's talking about surrender in more kind of like devotional terms here, by melting into nothing, by always thinking with love of God's feet. If you always think with love of God's feet, you're effectively ignoring everything and letting go. It's another very, you know, another way of saying surrender, basically. You can have surrender with a more slightly devotional flavor, or you can have it with less devotional flavor. You know, it doesn't really much matter. Truthfully, of course, I do think it's always helpful for aspirants to recognize the supreme role of God and pray for help. But that said, you know, exactly how surrender is phrased, it's up to you. The point is that you surrender. That's the point, as much as you can. Incomplete surrender is the best you can do by yourself. Complete surrender is granted by grace. But if you do that, you destroy the supports on which the ego operates. The ego operates precisely because of the movement of the mind. When the mind, through inquiry or surrender, you know, ceases to move and then is examined, then what happens is you look through that little point on the canvas. You go through that point, and then there's an opening out, and that is, you know, that's the light of jnana that remains, basically. Actually, the light of jnana is there the whole time, right? Because it's not just through that little point in the puncture in the canvas. It's the whole painting is backlit the whole time. The light is going through it. You know, it's just that at the center point, it's relatively pure. The light is relatively pure at the center. That's all. Otherwise, it is illuminating, you know, various other kinds of paint. But if we want to see it in its relative purity, quote unquote, then we're looking towards the ego, which is that I, which is, it seems to be a piece of paint that's not. It seems to be one thing, it's always another thing. Okay, verse 291. If one wants to be saved, one is given the following true and essential advice. Just as the tortoise draws all its 5 limbs within its shell, so one should draw the 5 senses within and turn one's mind southward. This alone is happiness. So yet another point about the movement of the practice, whether it's self-inquiry or surrender, is away from the objects of the world, and including as well the away from the objects of the mind, which is just another internal world. And the truth is, right, you see, I like the phrasing here, turn one's mind southward. See, I like this better than saying, even though it's said in other parts, perhaps in this text or other translations of Maharishi, you know, abide in the self. I prefer turning it southward because the reality is self is not an object which you can be in exactly. Self is precisely not an object. what you do is you're moving in a certain direction. That movement away from thought, that is the movement selfward. And that is, in a sense, what the self itself is doing all the time. The self itself is in constant self-contemplation, you might say. The self does not think of objects. The self is moving, always moving inward. And that inward movement is its self-abidance. Its self-abidance is, it's not thinking of a specific thing. It's the movement away. It's the movement away. That is the movement. That is the self. It's like moving towards the horizon, like that. So that's the way to think about the movement inward. That as you move continuously inward, that very movement becomes recognized as non-movement. It seems like it's movement from the perspective of the mind, but that's the continuity of the self, actually.
So here you mentioned about the five senses, correct? Like, it looks like similar to what Patanjali also says, like, the movement of the mind is propelled by these, because of these five senses.
Yeah, sure.
So when the five senses are like under control or managed thing, then the mind can bring to that stable state where.
Yeah, you control the senses and the mind becomes quiet, right? And then when the mind becomes quiet, then you want to examine to whom it's quiet, basically. It's quiet. Okay, verse 293. Having known for certain that everything which is seen, without the least exception, is merely a dream, and that it, the seen, does not exist without the seer, turn only towards self, Satchidananda, without attending to the world, names, and forms, which is only a mental conception. So this is a perfect definition of surrender. Perfect definition of surrender, right? So you simply know that everything which is seen, everything without exception, is a dream. And it's merely a kind of extension of the seer, essentially. Turn towards Satchidananda, being, awareness, bliss. Don't worry, ignore all the names and forms, and those are in the mental conceptions. So this is exactly the practice, right? You need to practice this, basically. This is the moving self-word. I will say, by the way, this is just a side point, but I might as well, since I'm thinking of it. So Satchidananda, being, awareness, bliss, right? Again, we want to see how the language of Vedanta contains within it certain important movements, So I think I already said the other day, on the one hand, Brahman is defined as Satchidananda. On the other hand, Brahman is also defined as nedi, not this, not that. That is to say, cannot be defined. And those seem like contradictions. And in a way, it's a necessary thing to note that, because that contradiction is like a useful contradiction. Satchidananda, being, awareness, bliss, is similar, right? So why is it defined this way? So, and in what way is that definition true, and in what way is that definition false or incomplete? It is true that Brahman, or the self, is being, awareness, and bliss, but these three descriptors are not necessarily the way that we use them in common language, because the being of Brahman, the being of the self, also includes what we would normally consider to be non-being, like absence of things, the lack of the presence of things, Chid, being awareness. Well, Brahman also includes what we would normally consider to be unawareness. Like when we are in coma or in deep sleep, we would normally say, the person's, in common language, you'd say the person's unaware at that moment. And yet, that too is encompassed in the awareness of the self. And Ananda, or bliss, we think of that as simple happiness, but actually the bliss of the self is a little bit more complicated than that. I was using this analogy earlier, not here, but in talking, like if you watch, for example, I like this metaphor. If you watch a sad movie, you might be experiencing sadness, the injustice of what's going on, et cetera, depression, anger, et cetera. But you could still find the movie beautiful because it's well acted, it's well directed, you know, cinematography is good, right? The artistic quality of the movie can be appreciated even if the emotional content is unhappy. So there's an aesthetic element, which is you can't pin it down to simply saying it's pleasure or pain. It runs through both pleasure and pain. So we have to understand these three descriptors, but yet why is it, you know, nevertheless, so these three descriptors are given, we have to understand they encompass their opposites. So in some sense, they're not as straightforward as they seem. And yet it is also true that we have these three descriptors because they are pointers. What is a pointer? A pointer is something which, as you are journeying in self-inquiry and surrender, you're like educating your intuition in a way. Your intuition, the basic knowledge of who you are is in some sense there. It's covered over. The basic knowledge of who you are is rooted in your intuition. All these pointers from the scriptures are, in a sense, trying to get you to recognize something that you already know, but which is obscure. There is a sense in which Brahman really is being, awareness, and bliss. And those are sort of recognition points of that your intuition will start to recognize as you go deeper and deeper into concentration. But it's also important to recognize, nevertheless, as you go deeper and deeper, that these three descriptors also include their opposites. And also that these three descriptors, in the end, nothing applies to Brahman. It's beyond description. So all of these things are pointers, right? So we're trying to not get caught up in any one thing, but to keep multiple perspectives in mind. And those are going to sink in and blossom as your practice deepens. As your practice deepens, your mind will become more concentrated, and something in you will like start to recognize what the meaning of these things are. It's like someone like, you know, suppose like you're trying to describe, I don't know, color to someone who had been blind from birth or something like that, right? And then slowly, maybe they started to regain their sight, you know, very, very slowly, right? They might start to understand like, oh yeah, like this thing called red, you know, I heard about it, read about it. It was described in all these different ways, you know? And they might slowly start to recognize it as their sight comes back, you know? All these seemingly contradictory descriptions are actually, they make perfect sense to someone who can see. But someone who's blind, it seems like it's contradictory in a way, but they're really describing different facets of something that can't be easily contained in language, basically. So I just want to say that. Okay, verse 299. Having come under the sway of grace, ever revel in the dense, blazing mass of supreme knowledge, the feet of Lord Hara, the indestructible reality, without yielding to the mental activities of thinking and forgetting. So I think here, what's relevant here is, the most relevant aspect is without yielding to the mental activities of thinking and forgetting. Because that is, in a way, you know, what catches us up, essentially, is those processes. What we're trying to do, in effect, with self-inquiry and surrender is like short circuit those processes. Because when you inquire into who has this thought, what you're effectively doing is you are putting like a stick in the gears of the thinking and forgetting process, basically, by drawing your attention to the gaping hole in your usual way of looking at things. Because when you think normally, the thinking has to be based on your, like, there's a profound inner belief that you are something, that you are something. And when you say something, when I say something, I mean something limited, something limited. Starting with, I am the observer, and building on that, like layers, things that like accumulated that are your identity. Without that identity as a basic, as a base, you can't really think. So there's basically this kind of huge unexamined like assumption that's required for thinking to happen, because without that basic, that base, you can't differentiate the world. Without that assumption, you have no basis from which to address the world. Without the sense of I'm this thing. Of course, it doesn't. It's incoherent actually. If you really look at it, it doesn't make any sense. But it seems to make sense. And from that seeming to make sense, then you can operate in terms of I'm here, everything else is out there. Everything else that's out there, I give names to, and then I, organize it in terms of time and space, and then I think about my relationship to it. I want this to happen. I don't want that to happen. Right? All those things are starting from this implicit assumption about who you are, which is not an unexamined assumption. As soon as you draw your attention, let's say via inquiry, to that unexamined assumption, like you kind of halt the mind in its tracks. You halt that thinking process essentially, even if only for a moment. So, forgetting relates to that. Thinking is related to memory. Memory relates to forgetting. So all of these things are connected. Same thing with surrender. As soon as you recognize for a moment, oh, this is all a dream, these are just names and forms, then thinking and forgetting for a moment at least grind to a halt. So it's the purpose of the practice to grind these processes to a halt and then look. Now, I would want to say, again and again in this process, we want to maintain these multiple perspectives because, what I want to say is, to the one who is, in fact, who has come under this weight of grace and who does revel in the blazing mass of supreme knowledge, thinking itself is no longer thinking. We want to be careful here because, see, there's a practice for the seeker, which is we are trying a way to interrupt thinking. But then, in the very end game, thinking is itself not a problem. Just like for the self, thinking is not a problem. The self is unaffected by thinking. It's only from a certain viewpoint that thinking is a problem. It's from that viewpoint from which we identify with the thinker, basically. But for one who is not so identified, is there thinking at all? Even when there is thinking, that thinking is not thinking. Because in order to label it as such, right, the moment you speak, then there's an issue. But the question is, who's saying something is happening? Who's saying speech is happening? When one thinks, in order for that thing to be thought, whatever is thought to be thought, it has to be thought as a second thought that this thought has happened, this first thought has happened. But who's saying that? And in order for that second thought to be there has to be a third thought which says, oh, the second thought has happened. But if it goes on like that, is there ever actually a thought, a stopping point? The whole chain of thought, who is saying it exists? This is the underlying thing that inquiry is trying to point out. You see, we seem to be thinking, we seem to be saying things, but who is asserting that? Who is making that assertion? So that what remains when you examine it is not exactly no thinking, but a recognition that the division between thought and no thought is itself like flawed in a way. It's very much like this. There's a very, very famous, Zen Buddhism koan, right, which says if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. The point actually of that koan is not whether it makes a sound or not, but that if there's no one there to hear it, we're now outside of the categories. We're outside of the categories of whether it makes a sound or not. That very question is rooted in the wrong perspective, in a way. That's what it's trying to point out. There's one perspective and there's another perspective. There's a quote unquote relative perspective and there's the absolute perspective. And the absolute perspective is there are no perspectives. So because so it gets quite confusing to talk about it because we're talking about the limitations of language to express the truth. But the point is ultimately, it's not exactly that thinking is a problem or that forgetting is a problem. Ultimately, even the I is not a problem. Ultimately, nothing is a problem. Ultimately, nothing is a problem because there's no problem. Right? The problem is itself a delusion. And even the idea that there's a delusion is itself a delusion. And that's a delusion too. On and on and on. So there's no issue, really. There's a phantom, you see, a phantom which when examined, that's what disappears. It doesn't just disappear, that doesn't exist. So this is the nature of what's going on. Just to keep that in mind. Okay, verse 337. Brahma Vidya is nothing other than seeing that which remains when all these three, the mirage-like world, the seer of that world, and the bright eyes seeing are burnt without a trace. This is a reference to this idea of the sort of triad of seer, seen, and the process of seeing, right? Which happens in this waking state. So again, look at the inherent contradiction in this, right? So Brahma Vidya, or supreme knowledge, right? It's nothing other than seeing what remains when the seer and the seen and the seeing are all gone, right? Like you see there's an inherent interesting contradiction there, right? Mm-hmm. It uses a word in one way, but at the end of it, the word is completely transformed, it means something else entirely. The seeing that it refers to cannot be ordinary seeing, obviously. It's saying that seeing, which we're referring to is the seeing which remains when ordinary seeing is gone.
Is it gone or all become one?
Well, this is a semantic question. Because that very division, the point is the division into those different possibilities is itself a problem. That division is not true. Is it one? Is it gone? If it's one, can it be said to be there? Because when we say something is there, it's always against a boundary.
I think it becomes like the same contradiction as like knave.
Yeah, it's the same contradiction as maybe exactly something like that. I mean, we'll say it's interesting, right? Because and this is all relevant to this, right? So these are all things that are all connected concepts, but the ego that we're looking for, the ego which is the hole in the painting, the thing which we have that is our basic sense of I that we're looking for, let's say in self-inquiry, right? It's so important because, among other things, it arguably seems only to exist in the waking and dream states. Our normal sense of I as a separate person, like our self-awareness does not seem to exist in deep sleep. So what the implication is that our normal waking sense of self-awareness cannot be the self. It's a thought. it's a thought that arises under certain conditions, arises in the waking state, arises in the dreaming state, but it's not supreme awareness. So what's happening in this verse is pointing to this fact that the seeing, you see, if we have, for example, the waking and dreaming states where you have in different senses, you have some sense of individuality, sense of being a separate being, a sense of self-awareness. And that's contrasted, of course, with what you're seeing. So I'm here, I'm seeing other things, whether it's a dream or waking, either way. We call that, some kind of normal awareness. And in deep sleep, you lack that element. There's no, everything's all one in a way, but everything's also all non-existent in a way. The self is said to be that which sees all three of these states, you see?
Mm-hmm.
So we have our normal conception of seeing, which is the waking and dreaming state, which is a seeing based on individual distinction, like me, not me. Deep sleep, those distinctions are gone. The self is, in some sense, aware of, quote unquote, aware of, both ways of being.
So Akilesh, this thing always bothered me a little bit, that the fact that the self is aware of the sleep state is only known after the fact that when we wake up. So it's some sort of reflection, store, something that happens. How does one kind of, can that be a clearer conception of that?
Yeah, so the classical argument for, Vedantic argument, at least as I understand it, for why it is that we believe, see, the thing is, there's two things to say here. So there's a classical argument for why it is that we think that consciousness continues even in deep sleep, right? And that is that supposedly when you wake up, you have a kind of very primitive, rudimentary memory of having slept, right? That's the argument.
Right.
And you could take issue with that. You could say, well, does that really prove it? Does it not prove it? I don't know. That argument, like all logical philosophical arguments, I think has its weak points. But the deeper realization, see, when you investigate the ego deeply, so you already know it at the very beginning, really, of self-inquiry, you already know it in a way, logically, right? Because you know that you can't be what you're aware of. You can't be what you're aware of. That's the starting point of self-inquiry in a way. You can't be what you're aware of. You're looking for yourself. You can't be what you're aware of. And that's the way self-inquiry moves. But you also know at the very beginning that you're aware of your existence. That's also the very starting point of inquiry. You're aware of who you are, now look for it. If you're aware of who you are, then by that logic, you can't be this sense of your own existence. That very sense of your own existence is itself an object. When you delve through self-inquiry or through surrender, right, to the point where it becomes quite clear what that object really is, when the illusion, you see past the illusion, if for a moment only or permanently, then in that moment it also becomes clear in some way what that there is something beyond that. So that beyond that, in that moment, it also becomes inevitably clear, if that is grasped, or that insight is had in some odd way that can't be fully described, that all the three states of consciousness are merely thoughts. It has to be the case. It's not a logical inference. It's an insight. It's a direct insight. So that's how it's known. That's how it's truly known, you might say. Yeah. Before then, we have to go based on a kind of logic / what the scriptures say, and it's kind of a mixture. But that's the basic idea. So the way that consciousness, all these terms move, right? Because there is a link, we'll say, right? Between I, the waking state, and the true self. There is a link. It's not that there's zero link. The I that's in the waking state is the ego. The ego is an object, it's not the subject. At the same time, the ego is a very, very, very special object. It's an object which is a pure reflection of the higher self. It's a reflection, it's a pure reflection of the higher self. So it is true that we are, but to know that we are in the waking state requires this extraordinarily special mirror object, which is the ego. It's just that when you look very, very deeply at that mirror, it vanishes, and because it's not, because it can't be what it seems to be, basically. And in that moment, it's grasped that there's a higher seeing that's always occurring. The higher seeing is what we really are. But that higher seeing need not express itself in our normal waking state of self-awareness all the time. It could be without that state, and it would still know itself. It would still know itself directly without the need for another object. It's just that its version of knowing is not the same as our waking version of knowing. We have a very specific waking version of knowing, which is subject-object knowing, which is divided knowing. That's dualistic knowing. We think, because we identify ourselves with the mind, that knowing is the only possible knowing, because it's inconceivable to the mind. How could there be any other kind of knowing? It doesn't even make any sense. It's like nonsense, right? That's what it sounds like. But if we actually investigate and look very deeply into the roots of the seeing process, then it suddenly becomes apparent that there is something else going on.
But that can also say that the consciousness is there always, even in the deep sleep, because that is the connect between, like Raj asked, when
Yes.
you wake up, it recognizes that you are in the sleep, and you are awake even before the sleep. There is 3 points, right? Awake, sleep, and we awake.
Right, we're told, right. That's
but something is like observing these 3 states.
Yes.
To make that connection, that we can say the consciousness still is like a background process monitoring.
Yeah. So absolutely. So yes. No, we can say that exactly. But what I really want to say, what I'm pointing out is, in a way, that's like a temporary view. Like the real view is the very idea of 3 states is itself a thought.
Yeah.
So times of thought, spaces of thought, the 3 states are a thought, right? But there is something more, I will say, than our current conception of what it means to know something. I don't know if that was clear or not. It's going to be you can ask more questions. The only way to clarity is through further discussion and through looking within, because this is, on this point, this is where it's very, very hard to express, because it's the fundamental limitation of the mind. The mind can only see what's broken up into those 2 pieces. So we're talking about something which is, well, what observes that process, that broken, what we consider seeing is only a special instance, a very, very special instance of a more profound kind of seeing that's going on, that the mind can't directly itself, it can't see that process in its totality, you might say. It can only see it via reflection. So what we're trying to do with that is we're trying to get the reflection to reflect back on itself and see the nature of reflectivity itself. What is this nature, this thing called reflection? That's what's happening. That's why it's called, in Vedanta, maybe yoga, right? It's our normal waking consciousness is reflected consciousness. It's reflected consciousnss. That is, the self, as pure, so-called pure consciousness, is reflecting against a kind of mirror thought. That mirror thought, which is so subtle, which is so mysterious, magic. That's magic. That's basically Maya. That's the ego, basically. Is initially a pure reflection of the self, because the first thing is it's just aware of awareness. And then it adds on identifications, basically, you might say. In a way, right, you can't actually have the self-realization game without an ego to begin with. In a way, self-realization becomes the supreme achievement of the ego. The ego finally sees itself. If you didn't have an ego, you couldn't have self-realization in the game we're playing, you see. You have to have a kind of seeming ignorance in order to have a seeming finding. It's like hide and seek, you know? You have to, in order to play the game, you have to have, the drama has to be set first through the thing being hidden, and then you have to find it. So that's what's going on.
So does the ego find itself, or the ego, or there is?
It's both and neither. It's both and neither. Yes, exactly. Because you could say it's like the novel we were talking about the other day, right? In the novel, there's no real character there. There's a shell. There's a hypothetical or speculated upon character. You read the text and you imagine somebody having an experience.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, there's an imagined person having this finding experience.
But it starts with recognizing the ego, then that's stepping stone, correct? Then you go forward and see that there's nothing like ego.
Yeah, I mean, the recognition, ego seeing the ego, and that if the ego sees the ego, quote unquote, then in that very moment, it must see that it's like Pinocchio finding out that he's a wooden boy, But if he's a wooden boy, he's not real. So how can he have that recognition, right? The very recognition destroys itself. The recognition is, I'm not real. So I can't have this recognition. This recognition is not real. That's the recognition. So it is and it isn't. That's the nature of the ego. That's the nature of ignorance. That's also the nature of self-realization in a sense, if we view it as the
So
game.
would it be something similar to, the book example that you gave got my attention a bit, right? So when I'm reading a book and then there's a character in the book, let's say I'm reading Ivanhoe, and then I suddenly identify myself to be Ivanhoe and I forget my true identity.
Yes.
Because I projected this character like from the text of the words, like you said, and there's enough to project. Now the whole game is, how do you teach this projection to realize that it's actually me who's projecting it?
Yeah.
In a sense, the projection is just me.
Well, right. So really,
so I'm just thinking myself out of this mess.
Right. Well, I mean, so I think they said the other night, but I'll repeat this. I think it's important. Really, the person who's lost in this delusion that they're a character, imagine that the novel is written about them. So imagine it's it's a novel written in the first person, using the word I, and it says, and that I is going through a life, right? And then you're reading about a novel about somebody who's having the spiritual search, and then they realize, oh my God, like I'm not who I thought I was. I'm actually the real truth is everything I thought was a fiction, and really there's only a reader, let's say, right? That whole set of realizations does not really occur to anybody. You see that?
Yeah.
Because it's just text. The reader is reading the text and generating the imaginary vision of somebody who was living that life and then going through a spiritual search and then supposedly finding out that their whole life was a lie and that actually something else was really the case. That whole series of revelation is just in imagination the whole time.
Yeah.
And again, we can go even deeper than that and say, really, even the reader of the book, is themselves a character in a second book. Yeah. And that second book has its own reader, a second reader. And that second reader is a character in the third book. So we don't want to stop at any point and say, oh, this is real, because then we are succumbing to a kind of a problem. We're basically saying that we're taking one object and making it real. But actually, the point is the unreality of all objects. The chain as a whole, the inconceivable chain, maybe we could say that's, it's so mysterious, you can't even talk about it, basically, because everything we say about it is within the chain. See, all language is within the chain. We can't really talk about the chain, really speaking.
So when
but-
you awaken, does this chain disappear, or you still revel and marvel at the chain?
Well, no. So, who's to answer the question? You see, anybody who can answer the question is within the chain, right? So the real truth is, it can't be said. That's why it's in so many places that Jnani's experience cannot be talked about. This is not merely words; it's a fact. Because if it could be talked about, if it really were something that were a something, then it would be an experience. So it can't be said. Do they see? Do they not see? You know, it's there's an anecdote which I would also like to tell, which Maharshi he retells it, but it's from the Yoga Vashishta.
Oh,
And so there is a hunter who's chasing a deer. Okay, and the deer is like darting through the forest, and he can't find it for a second, but it's obviously gone right past this sage who was sitting on the forest floor with his eyes wide open. And the hunter says, "Well, which way did the deer go?" He asks the sage. And the sage says, "I don't know." And the hunter says, "You're sitting there with your eyes wide open. The deer went right past you. How do you not know which direction it went?" And he says, "Well, we who have burnt the ego, we don't see." Something like that. And then Maharshi says, someone could then ask, well, then how was he talking to the hunter? But that would be missing the point. Or maybe it is the point. There's something here which, see, his seeing is not seeing. His speaking is not speaking. And that's the truth, right? So there's something which escapes the divisions. You see, we're trying to say, is it this or is it that? But the division itself is based on language. Language itself is based on the identification with the waking seer. And that initial identification is false. Therefore, the divisions are false. Therefore, it doesn't land into one category or the other. That's what non-duality is. Okay. Next verse. Oh yeah, so this is relevant. So 351. When scrutinized, is there any existing thing such as ego, the troublemaker, except a mere name? I. Certainly not. If at all anything exists for the name I, it is truly self, just as a thing which exists for the false name, the snake, is truly a rope. So probably many of you know this whole snake rope analogy, right? It's a way of looking at the ego, basically, as it seems to be a snake, it's actually a rope. But it's the nature of the ego that when you go looking for it, it seems to not be there. And that's what he's pointing out to when he says, does it really exist except as a name? No. And if anything exists, it's just the self. See, the mystery of the ego, which is, what is the mystery of the ego? The mystery of the ego is, how can something which is one without a second, which is the self, suddenly seem to be many? How can the one seem to be many, basically? That's what we have here, right? We have all these names and forms. Like, how can this, and we have these seemingly different people who have seemingly different experiences, how can that be one? So that mystery, which is the ego, is really nothing other than the mystery of the self itself, really. Maya is Brahman. So that as soon as you plunge into the mystery, it's exactly the same as plunging into self. Ignorance is so profound because it is the magic of the self that it is able to pull off this, like, literally, truly mind-blowing magic trick, basically.
Yeah, Mandukya Upanishad says the same thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because this is a magic trick of sorts. And the magic trick, when you investigate it, then it seems not to exist in the way that it seems to. So there's something very, 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 very impossible to pin down about it. That's the point here. We're trying to understand it. You can't understand it because understanding is caused by the very notion of understanding is coming from the problem, you might say. 352. When the ego dies, its base, the supreme self, shines in all its fullness. No harm comes to you, self, when the ego dies, therefore don't be afraid. So this is speaking to, I think, this it's a very understandable thing. When people practice, and as their attachments are weakened, and especially if they get certain glimpses of the truth, sometimes, not all the time, but they can be filled with fear. Because it could feel like I'm going to lose everything. I'm going to lose everything that was valuable, that's precious, that's beautiful, and everything that seems to be me will go, precisely because what feels like you is it's not you. What feels like you is something you have wrongly labeled as you. That's all. And Maharishi is trying to say here.
So what, you will get fear? I mean, what did you say?
Yeah, you could be afraid, because if you look deep within for I, and you suddenly get this flashing sense that you're not what you seem to be, in that moment, potentially everything, especially if attachments are strong enough, then in that moment, you might feel afraid of, because the self can't be known by the mind. So if you surrender, if you give up, in that giving up, what that giving up could feel like to the mind is like overwhelming darkness, because it can't see. You see, it can't see. So it wants to know, it wants to see the self. It wants, which would mean making the self an object, you see. But the self is not an object. In order to be seen, right, we've just seen in the verse before, the normal seeing process has to stop. And if that normal seeing process stops, then the normal mind, does not get to see. It has to be content with, it does not get to go into the inner temple. The true self alone gets to, so it only knows it at the boundary, you might say. Like in the Bible, it said this, I like this analogy, not that I know much about this particular story, but Moses is said to have been able to only go to the boundary of the promised land. He couldn't actually enter it. Even though he was such a powerful, important prophet and the leader of Israel and all that, he had to stop at the boundary. So it's the same thing with the mind. The mind can only go to the edge, and then it has to let go. It does not get to see God itself, because God is not a seeable object in that way. So that can feel fearful,
But the ego can also create this God as the ego, correct? To hold on to that.
You mean like a vision of God, or a version of God?
Yeah.
Sure. Yes, yeah, of course. Ego can cling to an idea, of course. Yes.
Ego might even see a vision and imagine that.
Yes, exactly. That's right. But that's why it's so important to move beyond all ideas. Any questions so far?
So the profound seeing should be the object, should be the goal.
Yeah, profound seeing should be the goal. And so Maharishi is trying to just reassure you, right? Like, don't be afraid. There's nothing to be afraid of, right? That nothing valuable is lost. Everything precious is preserved, basically, because sometimes it can be. What happens is you go towards it again and again and again, and then slowly the attachments wear down, and the mind becomes more trusting. It's sort of like, if you had never ever before slept in your life, then the first time you fell asleep for a second might be like, what happened? Like, that's scary. I don't know what that was. Something happened, like a blip happened. I don't know what that was, right? But over time, if you do it again and again and again, you start to be like, oh yeah, well, whatever it was is good. Yes, I want more of it. So that's
power nap.
yeah. and that's exactly the case, right? When you are falling asleep, right? If you try to see the point at which you fall asleep, you'll never fall asleep. You have to let go. The exact point at which you fall asleep is never seeable. verse 360. Know that the natural, unbroken, and ever-existing heart, I, which shines free of delusion, is the Shuddha Hankara, pure I, which is seen in Jivan Muktas, since it has no sense of doership in any activity. So yeah, so I want to mention basically a couple of things here. So he's mentioning heart again, right? So he wants to tie again the sort of very, very initial sort of sensation that we have of the I being sort of roughly kind of in the physical heart, but say really that's not that actually. It's actually nothing other than the pure, perfect, true self. And he likes to make the distinction between the I and the I dash I. So the I dash I is what happens is basically when you do the practice deeply, either surrender or inquiry, you do get your mind to the quiet state. And when you go further than that, you keep on ignoring that, even that quiet, and you keep recognizing this quiet as an object. And when grace does descend for a moment, in that moment, the mind can shift essentially into a different state, you could call that like duriya, like we were talking about the other day. In that different state, if it's just occurring as a state of mind, it's not exactly, you might say it's a very pure reflection of the self. But the point there is that in that shift of mode of mind, the normal I is not functioning in its usual way. It suddenly feels as if your normal identity is kind of like muted, and that you have a much larger identity than that. So if it happens for a period of time, then it is itself technically still just a state of mind. It's not perfection. But what it's really referring to, nevertheless, is the underlying truth. That is the actual truth. When you are in that state, you are awake for a moment, you might say.
So
And
this is what's termed asmita, I think, in the Yoga Sutras. Right?
It might be.
That sense of I,
It might be.
which has no particular identity.
Yeah.
And when one glimpses it, then you actually don't know who you are, what you are, where you are,
Yes.
but you know you are.
Yes, exactly.
So, muting the identity.
Sorry?
Muting the identity.
Yes, muting your usual identity and some other identity shines through. Exactly. Yes, precisely. So that's what's shining free of delusion. That's the pure I, so called, which is he's saying is seen in liberated beings.
No, that's still the ego then, right? Or no?
Well, that's a very good question. So in as much, that's the thing is, in as much as you think of that as an experience, okay? An experience is something which begins and ends, right? So if you say, I'm practicing, and then during this practice, this extraordinary change occurs where, once I felt like kind of in my limited little shell, and now suddenly I'm as big as the whole universe, right? In some sense, but the universe is even within me in some sense. The moment you think of it like that, it is an experience. If it's an experience, it's an object, and there has to then be a subtle ego there, actually. You have to then say there's a subtle ego experiencing. It's not the final thing, precisely because you're thinking about it. When you think about it as such, as a change, then it's an ego-based experience of some sort. Still, it's special. It's special because I like to think of it as it's a special mode of the ego, you might say, which is a difficult to attain mode. But it's still a mode of the ego. It's still a mode of the ego because it comes and goes. So really, the finality can only happen if it's not seen as that. Not seen as that. If it's seen the moment you see it as that, as a changeable state, then it becomes then you've entered the egoic way of viewing it, you might say, but actually it's simply the case all the time. That state
Hmm.
is not state. It's actually just the truth, period. There's only the delusion that it's not the case. Just like, for example, if you thought right now you were sitting in like Argentina, right now, right? But you're not sitting in Argentina right now, right? So for a moment, you're like, maybe I'm in California. You're like, whoa, I'm in California. And you get this amazing sense of like, oh my God, I'm actually in California. But all the time you've been sitting in Argentina, actually, right? Like, so the recognition of it is itself just a thought, but the underlying truth to which it refers is going on whether you have that momentary recognition or not. You're sitting in California the whole time. Never a perfect analogy because this is referring to a physical fact,
Yeah.
and this and we're talking spiritually. You have something which is your thought process itself, right? So it's a little bit different, but something like that is the case. Okay, verse 363. When the insubstantial ghost, the ego, which rises from the darkness of ignorance, and whose dance is itself all this universe is inquired into, it disappears like the bridegroom's friend in the story. And when it disappears, self, the sun, rises up, tearing away the darkness of ignorance, or Maya. So I like this because he uses this, I think he uses metaphor other places. The idea is that there's a wedding crasher, essentially, right? Someone who's not supposed to be at a wedding, right? He's supposedly the bridegroom's friend, right? That's what he tells everybody, right? But when someone's like, but who is he really? And starts to actually look for him, like hunt him down, like he starts to like run. And so you can't actually pin him down because it's like imagine like you have 100 people. Yeah, they all say it like, yeah, like, Bill told me, he was this guy's friend, and that you go to Bill and Bill's like, oh yeah, Thomas said this, and then she says, whatever, it goes from person to person. They all have heard this, some other person's connected to this story, but they can't actually get to the bottom of it. This is the way the ego works. Ego is basically hidden in this like network of thoughts, and the thoughts are all like referring to this entity called I, basically. And they all support each other because they're like, oh yeah, I have 1,000 other thoughts that all talk about I, so I must be real because all those other thoughts couldn't be wrong. But they're all relying on each other in that way. So it's completely unsupported. It's just mutual, like a big mutual lie, essentially.
Ego don't accept it as the ego.
Sorry?
It won't accept as the ego.
The thoughts.
Yeah, no, ego itself don't accept that it is the ego.
Well, right, exactly. You think it's real. You think you're real.
Yeah.
That's what it is. The sense that you have of being real, that's the ego. That is the ego. Yeah. So, and it seems supported. It seems supported because everything, but actually, when you start examining really what am I, then it suddenly becomes remarkably elusive. It's like, well, what is this thing that everything in my mind is talking about all the time and around which I lived my entire life, but actually, when I really look for it, I can't quite find it. I don't know what it is, that basically. And if you really, 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 really chase that I sense, you see, it will then because that sense is happening because again of this murmur of thoughts, it breaks down those supports. And when it breaks them down, eventually what happens is what it's talking about here, which is you see, there's the nature of the ego ultimately is of the nature. I'm repeating myself. Nature, but the nature of forgetfulness. So what the ego is basically a magical thought, which is it's strangely contradictory. It's capable of producing self-consciousness, which is our normal waking state of awareness, precisely because it hides something. it hides the actual self. In order to create the sense of the conscious, it hides the actual self. So it's exactly like in the way, again, to use a movie analogy, the way that the projected movie hides the screen behind it. So, so if you can get down to that point where you kind of isolated that, so the hiding is basically working through a constant movement of mind because it keeps you distracted. Like, oh yeah, think about this, think about that, think about the other thing. I want this, need that. I need to figure this out. I need this decision to be made. Blah 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 blah. And so it keeps you on your toes and moving and never able to fully really examine what's going on because that requires intense concentration and you're being distracted by all these things that you're supposedly concerned about. When the practice builds to a point where all that noise quiets down and you really are able to look where the magician does not want you to look, it will no longer be possible for it to hide. And in that moment, that what the so-called, veil of ignorance, which is a very, very, very subtle forgetting of what is actually the case, that veil then gets torn, you might say. That's what
there's a question, like you are reading from the text. Can you tell the text name they wanted?
Oh, the verse? So the verse.
Not verse alone. They want Guru Vachaka Kovai.
Oh, yeah. Guru Vachaka Kovai, it's called. Guru,
Prasad Guru Vachaka Kovai.
Yeah, Guru, Guru, Vachaka, Vachaka, Kovai, Kovai. One of Ramana's, most definitive statements of his views on all spiritual matters, you might say.
Yeah, I found the PDF online. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Any questions so far? All right, let me just see where we are time-wise.
15 more minutes.
15 more minutes, okay.
Where, like Das has some question.
Oh, sure.
What we see something through our eyes. I cannot see this. It is not the eye that sees, but the brain. So if we go one step further, is it okay to say that it is using the brain just like brain is using eyes?
Oh, that the ego uses the brain just like the brain uses the eyes. Yeah, sure. You could say so if you wanted to. You could view, see, from the spiritual standpoint, all the different like philosophical matters like that are really, they're only there for one reason, which is to motivate you to look inward at your own experience. So whether you want to say brain is an instrument used by the eye or some other relationship, say what you have to say to yourself so that you're motivated to look inward. Basically what it comes down to. Because the real truth is that none of those things are true one way or the other, right? There is an inherent wrongness to all statements, actually, to all statements, period. All language is false in some profound way. Because again, all language, I don't know if I've explained this point sufficiently, but the truth is it can't be explained, which is why I'm having trouble explaining it. But, all language, again, is based on the fundamental division between me and not me, me and not me. Only if there's a me, do you have a not me. And the not me is split into pieces. And those pieces become objects. And those objects are given names. And from those names, you have language. But there's an initial, there has to be, in order for that to be valid, there has to be a real separation between me and not me. There's an initial barrier that we take to be fundamentally true. Like there really is a me and there really is a not me. And then from that, we can then start the thinking process, basically. But if that initial barrier is wrong, the initial assumption, the founding assumption of all thought process, all thinking, all language, if that is not what it seems to be, if that initial barrier is incorrect, then like dominoes, everything else is undermined. It falls. because it all rushes like water into like this sort of like drain, into this black hole, this abyss of not knowing, which is the self. It's not knowing from the mind standpoint, basically.
Even if you see objectively, whatever you're perceiving through all our senses, okay, that the depth of perception changes from time to time. So that's not true, correct? So that's also shows that.
Yeah, sure.
Even if you see objectively.
Sure. Yeah. Even objects, even our relative knowledge, there so many ways it's flawed.
Yeah.
Basically. Yes,
Yeah.
it's flawed, it's changeable.
So there is
hard to
one
pin down.
another text here. When self shines, we are afraid because we need to hold on to something that is familiar to us. Kind of the example you gave regarding sleep.
Right, exactly. Yes. So
This is from
the
Das.
seeming unfamiliarity of the self. I mean, it's ironic because of course we are the self. Self is home. Self is the true home, and we are living it continuously. But there's again this delusion that we are something other than that. And that's why it seems terrifying and strange. It's it's almost like you've been looking through a telescope or something like that for as if you've been looking at it for years and years and forgotten there's anything else around you, right? So you're looking for where am I in the situation, but you're looking through the telescope to find yourself, right? You're looking and looking through the telescope to find yourself. Then you're trying to finally your attention comes back down through closer and closer, and you finally realize, oh my God, I'm looking through a telescope. That's not all there is. The mind is like that telescope. The mind is like an instrument of a certain kind of looking. And we have gotten deluded into thinking it's the only knowledge available. Everything is this, but it isn't. When you trace it back, that then becomes apparent. This is just an instrument. It's just an instrument, and it produces a certain sphere of experience. But that sphere rests in something larger.
There's a question, how do we then get used to that self, not be afraid?
Yeah, so practice, the fear itself has to be fed into the practice of surrender or self-inquiry. So as you start practicing, you feel the fear, let it be there. And if you're practicing surrender, you just note, okay, this fear is passing through. You don't have to stop the fear. You don't have to reject the fear. You don't have to say it's bad or judge yourself for it. You just notice it and let it be. That's what surrender is, right? I'm not going to react to it. And similarly, in inquiry, you would say, look to who is experiencing the fear. Who is experiencing the fear. And in this way, you will slowly start to see, I felt that fear, but then nothing bad really happened, actually. You'll expose yourself to it, and slowly you did. On the contrary, in fact, life is becoming clearer. Mind is falling into deeper peace. Things are getting better. And through repeated reacquaintance in this way, you will slowly, that fear will diminish and diminish. And also as the other attachments to other things diminish, because see, the reason you're afraid is you care about X, Y, Z, and A, B, and C. Those things are threatened. Those attachments are threatened potentially by this idea that everything is fictional. See, if everything's a dream, then everything you care about is a dream. It's not real, right? Which that's a threat. But as you become less attached to what you're attached to through the practice, then it matters less whether it's fictional or not.
Yeah, the fear is not for you. That's a kind of a
Yeah,
feeling.
exactly. Because the thing is, if really what you were attached to just wasn't there to begin with, it's less of a problem. Actually, what you're attached to is there. It's just not what it seems to be. That's all, really, right? So everyone and everything is there. It's just their actual reality is not what you think it is. That's the issue. It's all the self. It's all the self. Everything is the self.
But the answer to that question, you are saying the self-inquiry and surrender. Can we follow either of them?
Yes.
Or,
either of them is sufficient. You can also mix them because they're really so closely related. But really, either path will lead you to the truth. Either path. Because the point is that both of them are paths which, unlike other forms of meditation, they are not concentration on a a single object. They are the kinds of concentration where as you do them, the object of concentration naturally changes. And that changing process, right? As you keep on surrendering, your mind becomes like your mind becomes subtler and subtler, and you notice more and more that you didn't notice as thought. You start to recognize, oh my God, this is thought too. That is thought too. I didn't realize that's a thought as well. That dynamic process of discerning that you didn't discern before, will lead you to the truth. And same with inquiry. You start to realize, oh my God, I didn't realize I was identifying with so many things that I didn't realize I was identifying with. That process. So when you look for I, you're not looking for one thing. What you're looking at is a series of things that are all masquerading as I. So you're going through that sequence, basically. There's something through that sequence, you're following that line. So you're not actually, unlike other meditation, following the thing. So when you do this sort of kind of, these are the methods because they alone give you this sort of like progressive discernment of what you are. So either one will lead you to the truth.
But they can lead, one can lead to the other also.
Yes, of course, yes. In the end, they're basically the same, right? They're like, at best, slightly diverging, slightly different flavors of basically the same activities, essentially. Yeah. And the deeper you go into it, the more one implies the other. Because when you are, when you're inquiring, basically, like I said before, you're looking for I in the process, you are ignoring objects. That's surrender. And when you're surrendering, you are what you're trying to recognize is, what is my experience right now? Because I need to know my experience in order to recognize it as not me. When you recognize your experience as not me, you are implicitly looking into me. You're looking for me. You see that? They're sides of a coin. So you are inquiring, because when you inquire into the nature of not me, which is my experience, you have to inquire into the nature of me in the process. There's no other way. So they're almost the same, basically, but they have slightly different flavors.
Pinocchio's recognition.
Yeah, they lead to Pinocchio's recognition. That's right, exactly. Either one. I'll just do two last verses, I think. Yes, okay, so verse 368. Not even the least of one's miseries will cease until one knows that, by forgetting which one becomes deluded by the mighty agent, worldly Maya. So here we're talking about, again, the fact of the ego being this nature of the forgetting. You see, what you are is you're actually experiencing it all the time. That's the whole problem. Because every other experience alternates with something which is its opposite, we can recognize it. That's how the mind works, right? Like, oh, I'm feeling hot right now because I wasn't feeling hot a moment ago, and I won't be feeling hot a moment from now. So heat is an experience, therefore, because it has a boundary, basically. But if you're experiencing something which has no opposite, against what do you compare it or contrast it? Right? It's like a fish in water who's never known anything but water. It's like there's a joke, right? Like fish asks, fish asks another fish, again, like I've heard of this thing called water. What is it? They're in water all the time. So they have nothing to know it against. That's the difficulty here. See, so what we're surrounded by is it's ironic that we're literally staring at it, touching it, tasting it all the time, every single moment, but we can't see it because it is it's hidden by the contrast of the mind, basically. Actually, even the contrast of the mind, the truth is the contrast of the mind reveal it. You see, this is the self. This is all the self, but we can't see the we tend not to see our identity as that because of the forgetting that happens, the forgetting of the obvious. And lastly, verse 369. Let him who weeps over the death of his wife and children weep first for the death of his ego and the body, and attend to his own self. Then all his miseries will die completely. So again, right, all the pain in life we experience, it's because we take the unreal to be real. Simple as that, right? Wife, children, anything we've lost, any loved ones, or any dream we've had that we haven't had, come out the way we like. It's all because we take it to be real, and we take it to be real precisely and only because there's a subtle layer of illusion that covers up what we actually are. The nature of that illusion is that we don't look with concentration at the center point of the illusion, which is I. And because we don't look there, we then assume ourselves to be something we're not. And because we assume ourselves to be something we're not, we then take the world to be real. And because we take the world to be real, we suffer. But actually all of it is fictional. And it can be known directly through inquiry, basically, right? Don't take anybody's word for it, It has to be seen directly through your own, I'll put it in quotes, but still your own experience.
It's good.
All right, so we'll leave it at that for today.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your meme method?
Oh, you clearly read my first book.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, so I'll talk very, very quickly about this. This is something I don't really emphasize very much, even though I do think it's powerful. So in my first book, which is How to Find What Isn't Lost, I talk about needing an intellectual framework for seekers, kind of a certain kind of emotional equilibrium, and then methods of surrender and inquiry. And then in that emotional equilibrium part, what I say is, which is a little bit different in emphasis than the traditional emphasis of Vedanta, is that we should try to be honest about our desires. And sometimes that may mean acknowledging that we want certain things and even pursuing them for a while, because the dishonesty, it's said in the Gita, as well, right? One who abstains from something, but secretly in their mind really wants it, should be considered a hypocrite. So often what happens is we deceive ourselves what we really want, and we're in inner conflict with ourselves. This agitates the mind, and what we need to do is we need to become more honest about what we want. So I think in this process, I have to go back and exactly read the section, but so this part of this is that when we sort of related to this, essentially, this idea of finding what you want, at this juncture, at this point now, I would advise as a first line people fighting with inner conflict to go to something like psychoanalysis. But in that book, at that time, which was several years ago, I was talking a bit more about, sort of more kind of, you could argue, like self-help methods of sorts, which I do think are still effective, actually. You have to say that in English.
You make the papad.
Yeah.
So eat the papad and finish your dessert.
Yeah. Exactly. That's right. Exactly. Sometimes you have to do that. This new method, actually, I have to say, is not. It's connected to this issue of honest desire, but it's not exactly that. This is
Notice
it's a separate issue.
Metaphorize the expression.
Yeah, it's about metaphorization. So the idea is this, basically that, see, just like as I may have mentioned, I did mention earlier, like the beauty of the experience of Brahman, the ananda of the self, is not, it's not locked into either what we would normally consider pleasure or pain. Both pleasure and pain can be beautiful. In the same way, what I argue in this book a little bit is that one way, which is not the supreme spiritual way, but it's more like a adjunct way on the path to doing surrender or self-inquiry. But one way of dealing with and understanding ourselves is to recognize that we all have highly individual perspectives, and our perspectives are. You could say that our perspectives, maybe I don't think I'm going to give the full argument here, but essentially our perspectives are composed of connections between things, connections of like and unlike, basically, like and unlike. So our perception is structured in a way where we see resemblances in things. So I'm sorry, I'm really condensing this, so it's going to be a little bit confusing, but basically, our desires come from our perspectives, and when we try to express our experience, if we try to express our experience by writing about it or by any other mode of artistic expression, what we're doing is we're taking our experience and we are exposing some of the underlying resemblances that are there. And what I argue is this set of resemblances is unique to each person. And when you do that, when you artistically express what you're feeling, it's a mode of self-discovery, and it's also a mode of the appreciation of beauty, the beauty of your own perspective. And this beauty is somewhat relevant to the spiritual beauty that I talked about. Because even if you're undergoing a really negative experience, you see it all the time in so much art through the world, right? There's art about profoundly painful experiences. They take that pain and how they experienced it, and they express what it was like for them to experience it. The exact specificity of that experience then becomes converted into something beautiful, basically. So, this NEAM method that I talked about in this book is sort of a way to sort of look at that process.
But this desires, unless it is deep rooted, it comes and goes, right? It is not, as time goes by, even if you have decided something, after a period of time, you may not want that. So it is not a deep rooted desire. Only the deep rooted desire sticks with you.
Yeah, true.
That burns you.
That's true.
But most of the desires are temporary. It will come and go.
Sure.
So, but if you try to feed the desire, you are going to get into trouble.
Yeah. So I don't necessarily always advise feeding a desire. I agree with you. I think what's important is recognizing that you have the desire, first of all, right? Because often we have, so I think I mentioned multiple things here. First of all, this issue of honesty about what it is that we actually feel is it's hard to get to sometimes, because things, we have a certain image of ourselves, and we want to think of ourselves as being good and pure and generous and noble and this and that, right? When actually sometimes we may have feelings and thoughts that are less than that, right? Sometimes we feel greedy or envious or vicious or vengeful or any number of things which we're not supposed to feel, right? We're not supposed to want, So if we aren't able to admit those actual negative feelings and thoughts to ourselves, then we are at conflict with ourselves, because then we are trying to like not look. And it takes a lot of energy to not look.
So suppressing too much.
Yeah, it's suppressing too much, exactly. So that's one element, is just being honest about what it is that we seem to want. Then another level, I think there's a big question about when we have seemingly conflicting desires, like how do you address those conflicts? And my argument is really that if you have conflicting desires, it's because you need to really go deep into them and synthesize them in some way, and find some. This is all the psychological level, right? So this is, if you're doing pure surrender inquiry, you can just ignore all this stuff, because that will handle everything for you. But if you have psychological work to do, and most seekers do, if you aren't doing therapy, then one way or the other, you're going to have to come to terms with what I'm talking about, which is all these conflicting inner conflicts. Because otherwise, if you don't deal with them some way, then they will act as serious hindrances in the search for you. You will find yourself unable to proceed with smoothness on the inquiry or surrender road. You'll find yourself like, I just don't feel like it, motivational issues, you'll feel stopped. So yeah.
This is where, sorry.
No.
No, I was thinking this is where yoga could also be an additional tool.
Sure.
Because you could balance with the five, the elemental process, right? You can balance the elements in your system, the air, water, fire, ether, etc., to balance emotions. And every chakra has an emotional quality.
Sure.
From open and close. The bijas, the songs. Of course, it's not permanent. It's a fix.
Yes.
That you can make, and then you predominantly, you manipulate the knobs such that you predominate support, so that you have that.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think yoga could be a very good tool in the process.
Absolutely.
Right?
I agree with
Not
you.
the ultimate. It can't
Yes.
take you to the ultimate place, but it could be
Yeah, I fully agree with you. There's a variety of mind quieting mechanisms that can be like played with if need be. And so we need basically a certain good enough quietness of mind, to proceed with the search basically. And how do you know it's good enough? Well, when you are able to move forward in the practice in a relatively smooth way, basically. Even if you have a quiet enough mind, the practice will never be completely trouble free. It's going to be a series of bumps in the road for almost everybody. But yeah, absolutely. This is why Maharishi says at other points. I don't know if I cite this verse. Probably I don't think I picked it up, but he does say, okay, it's good to control your diet in certain ways. Food control is helpful for the seeker, is what he says.
Moderation.
Sorry.
Moderation.
Also the type of food.
And also the type of food
that's
basically, but more Socrates,
Yeah, Ramana doesn't advocate fasting. He doesn't-
Oh yeah. I don't necessarily do
Don't,
fasting.
yeah, he said, don't penalize your body.
Yeah. I'm not saying fasting, just
But ultimately, he penalizes his
No,
body.
but he was only jnani. So he
Yeah.
ignored the body because at that time he was in that state where he doesn't care.
right. Now exactly, I agree with you. So it's not about penalizing the body, but it might mean that eating certain kinds of
says
food.
not to penalize the body.
Yeah, 100%.
Penalizing the body is never part of it.
Yeah, 100% agree. Yeah.
No, that's not penalizing the body. Certain fasts don't penalize the body.
No, but all these things are different tools because we're all at different
For
levels.
discipline, yeah, correct.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. That's actually the key point.
The
See,
yoga, the asana part is okay, but what I'm talking of also is the bijas and the whole other chakra balancing system.
Those are
that you go
siddhis.
at. Not siddhis. Those are things you can directly experience where balancing it's more of a mystical type deal where you can, each chakra has a attribute to it and you can open and close it, right? So, and
Sure,
asanas
yes,
and
yes,
yeah,
yes,
so
yes.
they're just norms.
yes. See, exactly. So you can play with whichever set of systems in that sense
Right.
works for you, basically. And also I'll note again, right? So yeah, I mean, two things I think are relevant. One is yes, in some sense, every seeker is like a very individual puzzle.
Yeah.
So you have to find what works for you, and that that process is never cookie cutter exactly.
Yeah.
No, but Ramana has another objective thing also. Some of his followers also take that ganja. So he will call it Marundu. This guy has taken Marundu.
Yeah.
That guy will sing Tiruchirungal. He has poetry on Bhagavan. That guy is that ganja means that.
Oh yeah, right.
So,
Place, right? In fact,
Bhagavan didn't object to it. Ganja put Marundu put
That's fine, right? Yeah. It works for him.
the Yoga Sutras itself mentions it. Patanjali mentions Aushadha as the drug.
The big thing
It's
going
part
on
of
psychedelics.
But normally
Right,
he doesn't approve it.
right.
He should not do it. That's what he said. If somebody does
Yeah,
it and he can do
yeah,
it, he doesn't.
It's not even, there is no disapproval even, it's a valid path in many shaman practices to use it as a crutch to.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah. So I mean, that gets it. Because I think some people have it's a tool. I think some people have the mistaken notion. I think even here, but I think some people nowadays have the mistaken notion that it's a shortcut. It's not a shortcut. Psychedelics are not a shortcut to the self. But they can have they can give you a glimpse. Exactly. I do think, for example, they're valuable sometimes for people who are like staunch atheists, right? They have no notion of anything beyond that, right? And then they take a psychedelic and suddenly their eyes are open. They're like, oh wow, something else has happened there.
Yeah.
Sometimes that happens.
So that might give you the will that
Yes.
you set to inquire.
Yes.
Be strengthened by.
Yes, it's possible. It's possible. Quite possible.
But in general, they don't recommend that. He
No,
said
no,
for
no, that's
most
not
people, no drugs, no
Yes.
say to be sattvic food.
That's not.
That's a
true.
general recommendation.
No. The whole psilocybin thing is being revived. It's a pretty, science is coming to it. The psilocybin whole thing, how it can be. It's a pretty and the ancient Soma of the Vedic rishis. So it has its place, but it's been demonized because it can,
But
Take
some
the wrong
people have
way.
taken extreme.
Yeah, that's why.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Precisely.
So no one will endorse it.
Netflix, there is something about psychedelics.
I know.
What is it?
Psychedelics. Like the
Mushrooms, yeah.
Psilocybin mushroom. It
Psilocybin
really
mushrooms.
makes you like opens up.
But now they're actually differentiating that from the other drugs.
Yeah, sure. No, I agree with that.
Some drawings are not.
Sidetrack. Sorry to sidetrack this.
No, it's not
In fact, I wanted to have a discussion with you on psilocybin.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I think it's, it can give people glimpse, but some people take this, they just think they just can do a bunch of it, and then that's just like that's the whole practice. It's not. It's not.
That's bad, actually.
It's not. You have some very very crazy people on YouTube. and
There are
whatnot
lots of
doing
American
things
things
like
in San
that.
Francisco.
Oh, yeah. Santa Cruz.
If that's all it was, it'd be very easy. All right, well,
Okay.
Call for the night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I read the whole book. It's probably a little too dense for a dense guy like me. But
great, I'm so glad you did. That's great.
What do you do?
I downloaded this book and read it.
Oh, you downloaded it. First book.